Hi, this short lecture cast is going to supplement in a module in PhD 100 and also no doubt in a few other classes as a supplement, going over some basics as we really dive into the beginnings of long-term athlete development and looking at some of the major developmental milestones and things we need to keep in mind as we're reading about some more practical applications and best practices for training and strength and conditioning, especially for youth and people in our early stages of development. And so a couple things we need to keep in mind. We see a lot of really rapid growth in those early childhood years. And then in the elementary years, essentially it's steady growth, steady maturation, but it's not as fast as when we see with infants and toddlers, for example. And we have to keep a few things in mind. And this makes sense when we're teaching fundamental motor skills. So we know that when there's rapid growth, the ability to learn new motor skill decreases. And when we talk about motor skill in this concept, it's our fundamental movement concepts, motor skills, even more complex sports skills. And so what that tells us in elementary years, those 6 up through the beginning of puberty, it's really an ideal time for this developmental stage to be working on learning and practicing and refining movement patterns, movement concepts, space awareness, balance, strength. And so that's why in physical education, for example, that's the bread and butter of what we teach youth at this stage. It's all of these fundamental movements. And from the athlete point of view, we would also argue a lot of the basic athleticism fundamentals. This is a great time to teach those. But we also need to keep in mind that this stage of growth, that they're not just little adults and able to do necessarily all of the same things at the same intensity or level, even though I know many of these kids can. So we have to keep in mind with youth, their legs are going to be shorter compared to their overall height. So trunk is typically longer than the legs. And with boys and girls, there's some sex differences that we see. It's pretty similar for boys and girls until about age 11 is when puberty kicks in, specifically for the girls. Our younger youth tend to be more top heavy. So that's upper body, their head even. And so that's where we see a little bit more falling, lack of control of bodies with our younger elementary age kids. And then we know that as kids grow, their center of mass will lower. So they get a little bit more stable. And so major part of height increase from kids in this slower but steady maturation phase through the elementary years is from the legs. Couple things. So I mentioned the falling. So early elementary, falling is going to happen. It's a part of it. It's important that we allow kids the opportunity to fall and learn how to control their bodies. Proprioception, that's understanding where our body is in space. It's super key at this stage and should be taught and practiced. And so that's why a lot of times parents will ask me like, oh, what's the best sport to put my 6-year-old in, or my second grader, and should it be soccer or should it be football? And all the time, I mean, those sports are great, but I always will say a movement form or type of training that's going to involve a lot of proprioception. And so the big ones we see in our culture are going to be dance, martial arts, and gymnastics, and not necessarily the high competitive level gymnastics, but more so the instructional level. And at these early elementary stages, some key things I put in the slide: individuals instruction and isolated practice is key. And so that's also why activities like dance and martial arts and gymnastics, not that they shouldn't be playing anything team oriented. We want that from a social developmental standard, but from a learning standpoint, cognitively, socially, and just with their psychomotor development, they're not quite there to be able to handle learning proprioception, learning how to control an object, and having to do it with the other variables of other teammates and defense and offense, even though, again, we know they're able to. But if we're looking at key developmental stages, we should keep things a little bit more of individualized type of sport or individualized type of training. And it's fine if it's in a social setting, because a lot of these happen in classes. Later on in elementary, that's definitely where their center of mass drops, and it's a really great time for motor learning, for balance, and to incorporate strength for sure. And so that's where we want to see a ton of variety. So techniques, so learning how to kick, how to strike, how to punt, how to catch, how to throw, all of the different things we see in sport. So we want to see variety as opposed to specializing in one sport. And again, ton of balance and stability, super, super important here. Adolescence, we see even more growth of the limbs, more changes again in their center of mass, and this is where we really want to see some core strength development. Overall strength training is really important, and then endurance development. That's where we want to see this start to kick in. Couple things related to sex differences. So in elementary, we know that girls are going to hit their later elementary, they're going to hit their adolescent growth spurt first. Girls tend to hit puberty about 2 years earlier than boys. Boys are going to tend to be a little taller, a little bit heavier, but not always necessarily. We know that the boys' motor performance is related to their skeletal maturity, not their age or their chronological age. With girls, we're not quite sure. And so we see their motor performance is not related to their physiological maturity of their body. And we're not sure, is this due to socialization, that girls are socialized a little bit less into being able to know their body in space? We're not quite sure about that. Research isn't conclusive, or they just haven't been studied. One thing we do know, and this is really interesting, so we tend to give a lot of praise and excitement about kids that will show a ton of sports skills or might show a ton of strength at really early stages. We know research is pretty solid that late bloomers, late maturation is associated with later on in life exceptional motor performance. And so if we think of in our, maybe 20s, late 20s into early 30s as being that peak age for athleticism, if we think of our pro athletes, Olympians, we tend to see late maturation of the body. So a little bit later onset of puberty, a little bit later onset of their growth spurt. And a reason why that may be is they may have had more time pre-puberty in those kind of earlier stages of just steady growth, steady maturation, just develop some of those fundamentals. And then moving down into strength, we see minimal differences in the prepubescent ages of lower body strength until testosterone puberty kicks in. And boys are, though, going to have more upper extremity and trunk strength in boys and girls in that youth age. So what does this all mean, knowing that there are some sex differences between males and females? It's really, really important that we give equal opportunities for training and practice, but we also need to recognize, we saw that there is that lack of significant connection of girls' physiological maturity and their motor performance. That's going to mean we need more opportunities for motor pattern practice for girls. And it's, think of like getting someone up to speed. And again, I mentioned we don't exactly know, is it socialization, is it society, it's how we're, our culture of how we treat girls. And granted, there are many more opportunities than there have been in decades past, but it's important for us to make sure that we look at any groups that are a little bit more behind and we give them additional opportunity. Make sure they're up to speed. And what we also know, this is important, girls hit puberty sooner. And remember what I just said about later maturation tends to equal greater motor performance later on in life, or more exceptional performance later in life, because we know girls mature sooner, about 2 years earlier than boys. That in essence means that they have about 2 years of less opportunity for development of some of these fundamental motor patterns, movement concepts, basic athleticism. And we also know that there tends to be socialization away from psychomotor. That's, sport, kind of rough and tumble hobbies for girls versus boys. So it's really, really important that we, especially for this female population, make sure there's opportunities, we give them options. And honestly, it's not on the slide, but we give them encouragement because we know when there's socialization away or there's peer pressure away to do things that might not be as motor oriented, that they're going to need encouragement to do that. The skeletal age versus chronological age, very, very different. So you might have a range of 5 to 6 years of physical maturity or skeletal maturity of kids that are the same age. So you might have an 8-year-old that may have the physical or skeletal maturity of a 13-year-old, versus you also might have an 8-year-old with a skeletal and physical maturity of their body of maybe a 6-year-old or 5-year-old. And so we have to keep that in mind. Anytime we see age group classifications, like in school, we see that in a lot of our club-based sports, just because they're all in that same 9 to 10-year-old age range. If it's U10, their bodies internally are going to be quite different. Their motor patterns might be quite different too. And so just big thing is age is not a true predictor as much as we think. And again, it comes back to what's underlined, giving practice opportunities, options, making sure when we're in a coaching or teaching role that we're instructive and we make corrections so that these kids have this opportunity to learn. And the last kind of bottom line, coaching application. It's okay to match up partners and groups and opponents based off of their size, their physical maturity, even at sometimes in some situations, their motor ability level, because we want to make sure they have really quality practice opportunities. And just because we have two 10-year-olds and one's, a whole foot taller than the other, or has, 30 pounds on the other, might not be the best matchup, or has high level skill versus a lower level developmental skill. It's okay to have some mentoring opportunities and peer mentoring, but ultimately we want to have good practice opportunities. And so we need to make the call as coaches, what's going to best set that up. A few things in terms of just readiness for movement tasks. And this kind of goes back to that question I get from parents, when is there a right age I should send my kid up for, club soccer? And I always say it's a combination of a lot of things. Of course, their chronological age is going to come into play, but we want to look at their maturity and their skeletal age. Like, is their body ready for this? Can they, move without falling over? Do they have some of the basic motor abilities that will allow them to be successful in this team environment that has a lot of other variables? We know that, you're going to use the example of club soccer. That's a lot of open skills that are in that environment, And so that's really important that we make sure that they've got some of the closed skills down. And then especially we're looking at their psychological maturity, their social maturity. Can they handle being in that group setting? Are they able to take instructions from a coach? Can they handle being away from their parents? And then confidence is also really important. Quick mention on the role of obesity, because we see a lot of statistics with youth and physical inactivity and obesity statistics. We do know that there is some correlation with obesity and early onset of puberty, which is not a good thing necessarily. That just means there's less time for general maturation, less time for bone ossification. And we also know that if there's a greater percentage of body mass as fat tissue versus lean mass as fat tissue, that can contribute to being a less efficient mover. And so we've seen a good amount of research on this. Decreased motor performance, the strength to mass ratio is going to be different. It's going to be a little bit less, and that's a predictor of motor performance. We know that fat, so non-lean tissue, is the worst predictor of positive motor performance. And we know from a respiratory and vascular standpoint, less oxygen uptake that relates to our stamina. Cardiorespiratory endurance is going to be less, and just higher rate of perceived exertion. So we call that RPE, rate of perceived exertion. They're going to feel like they're working harder for less actual work. And so when we do have students or athletes that are going to be a little bit more overweight, maybe a little bit unconditioned, it's really important to make sure that our workloads and our workouts are based off of time. Instead of run 6 laps, all right, we're going to go continuously 10 minutes, or we're going to do 30 seconds on, 20 seconds off, and have time-based aspects, because we're going to see, especially at this youth age, a lot of differences because of puberty and because of maturation stages. And this directly impacts the culture of the gym, or the culture of the weight room, or the culture of the training session on the field. It's so important psychologically. And so we want to train the kids. We want to get them in shape for our sport or activity. We want to make sure that their motor patterns are developing, but we also want them to show up. And it's really, really important that we make it still an inclusive setting where they see it's a learning experience. And then really quickly, I'm going to jump into muscle fiber differentiation. We know it's genetically determined. There's a lot of new research that's coming out. And so we know that even though genetically determined number of muscle fibers, training will increase the size and the function, not the amount. We know there's a spectrum between slow twitch and fast twitch and different types. And so even though genetically the first few weeks of postnatal life, the percentages of those of us that have more fast versus slow on that spectrum, there is plasticity. So training and use will absolutely change them. And so we know that metabolic specialization doesn't happen until later when we see testosterone increases. And so we also know we've got to give kids some variety We want them to shift their focus, lots of different tasks. We want to give them different stations, different challenges. Quick little slide, I'm almost out of time, of how we can extend options. We modify, we change the rules, we give them parts, and then we add on. We change the space, the goal of the game, 2 versus 2, 2 versus 1, lots and lots of different practice conditions and practice movements. When I say opportunity to practice, this is exactly what I mean.